Some moments don't look like the beginning of the end, until everything starts collapsing at once. The sound of liquid hitting polished marble drew every eye in the room, a sharp, out-of-place splash in a mansion built for silence and control, and Emily Carter froze for half a second before slowly lowering herself down, one hand instinctively resting on her stomach as if grounding herself, the other reaching for a cloth that was already damp from the last spill she had been ordered to clean, her movements careful, measured. Almost practiced, like someone who had learned that speed only invited more attention, more correction, more quiet humiliation, and across from her, Vanessa Blake leaned back against the grand piano, swirling the last inch of deep red wine in her crystal glass with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, while Richard Vaughan, the billionaire whose name opened doors across Manhattan, stood beside her adjusting his cufflinks as if none of this required his involvement. As if the woman kneeling on the imported Italian marble floor wasn't carrying his child. As if she was simply part of the decor he had outgrown but hadn't bothered to remove, and the guests, men in tailored suits, women in silk dresses that whispered when they moved, pretended to stay engaged in quiet conversation, though their glances flickered back again and again, curiosity fighting with discomfort, because something about the scene felt wrong even in a world where power often blurred the lines of decency. And Emily could feel every second stretch, could hear the faint ticking of the antique clock mounted on the far wall, each tick louder than the last, like a countdown no one else seemed to notice. And yet beneath that stillness something else was happening, something invisible to everyone in that room, because near the doorway a woman in a simple black uniform stood with her head slightly lowered, hands folded, blending perfectly into the background, the kind of presence people stopped seeing after the first minute. Except her gaze was steady, focused, and for just a fraction of a second her thumb brushed against the side of her phone, a subtle motion, almost nothing, but enough. And miles away in a glass tower overlooking the Hudson, a notification appeared on a secured screen, 1 line, 3 words, no sender, no signature, just a command that had been waiting for the right moment to exist. And back in the mansion Emily finished wiping the last trace of red from the floor, the marble gleaming again as if nothing had happened, as if the moment could be erased simply because the evidence was gone. But when she lifted her head, her eyes didn't carry the softness they once did. There was something else there now, something quiet, something patient, something that didn't match the role everyone in that room believed she was trapped in. And Richard didn't see it, Vanessa didn't see it, no one did, not yet, because the truth had a way of arriving exactly when it was least expected, and when it did, it didn't ask for permission. The room tried to recover as if nothing had happened. Conversations restarting in low-polished tones, glasses lifted again, but something invisible had already shifted, like a pressure drop before a storm, and Emily felt it in the way the air no longer settled around her the same way, in the way the silence lingered half a second too long after every laugh, and she rose slowly, one hand still resting on her stomach, the other placing the cloth neatly on the silver tray beside her as if she had just completed a task expected of her. Because for months that had been her role, quiet, compliant, invisible, the woman who used to walk into rooms beside Richard Vaughan now moving along the edges of them, her presence reduced to something functional, something easily dismissed, and yet tonight there was a steadiness in her movements that had not been there before, a subtle shift that no one in that room was trained to notice because they were too accustomed to seeing only what reinforced their version of reality, and Richard glanced at her briefly. Just long enough to confirm that the floor was clean again, his expression unchanged, satisfied in the way someone is when order has been restored without effort, and he turned back to Vanessa who leaned closer to him with a soft laugh, her voice light but calculated, as if she were narrating the evening for an audience that existed only in her own mind, while across the room a man in a dark navy suit checked his watch, his attention drifting not toward the spectacle that had just unfolded but toward his phone, where a message had appeared without notification. A secure channel, silent but urgent, and his eyes narrowed slightly as he read it once, then again, confirming what he already suspected, before slipping the phone back into his pocket with a calm that suggested this moment had been anticipated long before anyone in this house realized they were part of it. And near the entrance the woman in black shifted her stance almost imperceptibly, her gaze lifting for a fraction of a second to meet Emily's. And in that brief exchange something passed between them, not recognition in the traditional sense, but alignment. Like two people aware of the same truth standing in a room full of illusions. And Emily looked away first, not out of fear but out of control, because timing mattered more than emotion now, and upstairs in the master suite a drawer remained locked, its contents untouched for months, documents that carried a different last name, a different life, one that had not disappeared but had simply stepped back into the shadows waiting for the moment it would be needed again, and that moment was approaching faster than anyone downstairs could possibly understand. And the antique clock on the wall struck once, the sound sharp and deliberate, marking the top of the hour as if announcing a transition no one had agreed to but everyone was about to experience, and one of the guests laughed too loudly at something insignificant, the sound breaking the fragile illusion of normalcy, while another checked her phone and frowned at the sudden loss of signal, a small inconvenience that would soon become a pattern, a ripple spreading outward from a source none of them could see. And Emily adjusted the sleeve of her simple dress, her posture straightening just slightly, enough to remind herself of something she had not needed to remember until now, that she was not defined by the way this room saw her, that roles could be assigned but not accepted, and across the city elevators in a glass tower began moving in coordinated silence, offices that had been lit late into the evening suddenly shifting into motion, screens coming alive, calls being placed, names being confirmed, because a single instruction had been enough to activate a system designed not for chaos but for precision, and back in the mansion Richard raised his glass to make a casual toast. His voice confident, controlled, unaware that the foundation beneath that confidence had already begun to fracture, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, methodically, the way real change always begins, and Emily watched him for a moment longer than necessary, her expression calm, almost distant, as if she were seeing him not as he was now but as he would be when the truth finally arrived, and then she turned, taking a single step toward the hallway that led deeper into the house. Each movement deliberate, each second measured, because somewhere between the silence and the signal, between the illusion and the shift, the story had already moved past the point of return. Power does not announce itself, it replaces the air you breathe before you even notice it is gone. Emily moved through the hallway with quiet precision, each step echoing softly against the polished wood floors as the noise from the party behind her dulled into a distant murmur, like a world she had already begun to leave behind, and for the first time that night she allowed her expression to shift, not into pain, not into anger, but into something colder, something measured. Because the waiting was over and what came next required clarity, not emotion, and as she reached the staircase her hand brushed the railing, steadying herself, not from weakness but from intention, grounding herself in the moment that would divide everything into before and after, and upstairs the air felt different, quieter, untouched by the performance happening below, as if this level of the house still remembered a version of her that had not been rewritten by humiliation and silence, and she entered the master bedroom without hesitation, her eyes moving directly to the drawer that had remained closed for months, untouched, unnoticed, and she knelt slightly, pulling it open with a calm that suggested this was not a decision made in anger but one prepared long in advance, and inside, neatly arranged, were documents that did not belong to the life she had been forced into, papers that carried the name Carter, a name that had once opened doors far beyond anything Richard Vaughn could control, a name she had chosen to step away from, believing love was enough to build something real, something equal. And for a moment her fingers hovered over the edge of the folder, not in hesitation but in acknowledgement of the cost that had brought her here, because leaving power behind had never made her powerless, it had only made her invisible to those who could not imagine it existing without display. And downstairs a guest tried to place a call and frowned when it failed, another checked her banking app and refreshed the screen twice. Confusion beginning to ripple through conversations that were no longer as effortless as they had been minutes ago, while Richard raised his glass again, attempting to reassert control over the room with a casual confidence that now felt slightly forced, as if something beneath the surface had shifted in a way he could not yet define, and Vanessa noticed it too, her smile tightening just enough to betray the first flicker of uncertainty, though she masked it quickly, leaning closer to him. whispering something that made him nod, reinforcing the illusion that nothing had changed, and yet everything had already begun to move beyond their reach. And in a high-rise across the city, a team of analysts monitored cascading updates across multiple screens, accounts flagged, transactions paused, access points restricted, all executed with precision that spoke of preparation rather than reaction, because this was never about chaos, it was about correction. And back in the bedroom, Emily lifted the folder, holding it with both hands for a brief moment, feeling its weight, not just as paper but as identity, as truth, as the line between who she had been forced to appear as and who she had always been. And she stood slowly, her posture shifting almost imperceptibly, her shoulders aligning, her gaze steady, the quiet transformation of someone stepping back into a role that had never truly left her. And the mirror across the room caught her reflection, not the version that had been diminished in the eyes of others, but something else entirely, something composed, something undeniable, and she turned toward the door, the sounds from downstairs now sharper, more fragmented. Voices rising slightly, confusion replacing ease, and as she began to walk back toward the staircase, each step measured, deliberate, the house itself seemed to hold its breath. Because somewhere between the silence upstairs and the unraveling below, the moment had arrived, not with a crash, not with a warning, but with the quiet certainty that nothing that followed would ever return to what it had been before. And this time, when she stepped into the light, she would not be the woman they believed they controlled. She would be the truth they never prepared for. The moment truth decides to walk into a room, it does not knock. The first thing they noticed was not Emily, not yet. It was the silence that fell half a second too fast, conversations cutting off mid-sentence as phones lit up across the room almost in unison, soft chimes breaking through the carefully curated atmosphere, and one guest frowned at his screen, tapping it twice as if the result would change, while another turned slightly away, her expression tightening as she whispered something urgent to the man beside her, and Richard Vaughn felt it before he understood it, that subtle shift in control. The way attention was no longer anchored to him but drifting, fragmenting, and he lowered his glass slowly, scanning the room with a sharper focus, his instincts catching up to what his eyes could not yet confirm, and Vanessa noticed his hesitation, her hand resting lightly on his arm as she leaned closer, her voice low, reassuring. But even she could not ignore the growing unease as more screens lit up, more expressions shifted, more conversations stopped pretending to be normal. And near the entrance the man in the navy suit stepped forward for the first time, no longer blending into the background, his posture straight, his presence deliberate, and he did not look at Richard, not yet. Instead his gaze moved through the room as if confirming positions, as if checking that every piece was exactly where it needed to be, and then Emily appeared at the top of the staircase, not rushed, not hesitant, but steady, composed. And for a brief moment no one recognized the difference, because she wore the same dress, carried the same quiet presence, but something in the way she held herself shifted the entire perception of who she was, and the light caught her just enough to draw attention upward, one person noticing, then another, until the room collectively turned, and the silence deepened into something heavier, something expectant, and she descended one step at a time, each movement controlled, each second stretching just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle, and Richard's eyes locked onto her. Confusion flickering first, then irritation, as if this interruption did not align with the version of the evening he had planned, and he opened his mouth slightly as if to correct her, to re-establish order. But the man in the navy suit moved before he could speak, crossing the floor with calm authority, stopping just short of the staircase, his attention now fully on Emily. And when he spoke his voice was clear, precise, carrying across the room without force. "Miss Carter, everything is ready." And the words landed with a quiet finality that no one immediately understood, but everyone felt, and Richard's expression hardened, his mind catching on the name, replaying it, rejecting it, because it did not fit the narrative he had built, and Vanessa's grip on his arm tightened slightly, her composure slipping just enough to reveal uncertainty. And Emily reached the final step, her gaze moving across the room, not searching for approval, not seeking reaction, but acknowledging the space as if it had already shifted into something else. Entirely, and she stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and the center of the room, the folder still held calmly in her hand, and around them the subtle unraveling continued, a guest muttering about accounts being temporarily inaccessible, another stepping aside to make a call that would not connect, and the illusion of control began to fracture, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, and Richard took a step toward her now, his voice measured but edged with authority. "Emily, what is this?" And for the first time that night, she did not lower her gaze, did not soften her posture, she met his eyes directly, her expression calm, almost distant, and in that stillness the balance of power shifted in a way that could not be undone, because what he saw in her was not defiance, not emotion, but certainty, and certainty was something he had never learned how to control, and behind her the man in the navy suit reached into his jacket, retrieving a document, holding it ready but not yet revealed, waiting, because timing was no longer accidental, it was exact, and Emily took one more step forward. Her voice steady when she finally spoke, not raised, not dramatic, but clear enough that no one in the room could ignore it, and in that moment every distraction, every whisper, every flicker of confusion fell away, leaving only the truth waiting at the edge of being seen, and no one there was prepared for what it was about to become. "The truth does not argue. It replaces the story you believed." Emily's voice did not rise, yet it carried across the room with a clarity that silenced even the faintest whisper, and for a moment no one moved, as if the entire space had paused to understand something it could not yet process, and Richard stood there, his expression caught between irritation and disbelief, his mind searching for a version of this moment where he still held control, where this was a misunderstanding he could dismiss. But nothing about the way she stood in front of him fit that narrative anymore, not the way her shoulders remained steady, not the way her gaze did not waver, and certainly not the way the man beside her now stepped forward, placing the document in his hand with a precision that suggested this had been rehearsed long before tonight, and without waiting for permission, without asking for attention, he spoke again, his tone formal, almost ceremonial. "Effective immediately. All financial accounts under Vaughn Holdings are under review and temporary restriction pending compliance verification." And the words landed differently this time, heavier, because now they carried consequence, and around the room the confusion sharpened into something more urgent, phones being checked again, conversations breaking into fragments, one guest quietly stepping away toward the exit, another whispering a name that traveled quickly from one person to the next, Carter, and Richard's jaw tightened, the first real crack in his composure appearing as he took a step closer, lowering his voice as if proximity could re-establish dominance. "You do not get to stand here and pretend this means anything." But Emily did not respond immediately, she let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle, for every eye in the room to fix on them, for every assumption to begin unraveling on its own, and then she lifted the folder slightly, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge its presence, and when she spoke again her tone remained calm, almost detached. "You built your world on what you thought I was willing to accept." And she paused, her gaze moving briefly across the room before returning to him. "You never once asked what I chose to walk away from." And the words did not accuse, they revealed, and that distinction made them impossible to dismiss, and Vanessa shifted beside him now, her earlier confidence replaced by a tightening stillness, her eyes flicking between Emily and the document as if searching for something she could still control, but there was nothing left within reach, not here, not anymore, and in the distance the faint sound of a notification echoed again, another guest reacting quietly, another confirmation that whatever had been set in motion was not isolated, it was expanding. And Richard reached for the document then, more out of instinct than understanding, his movements sharp, controlled, but the moment his eyes scanned the first page something in his expression changed, not dramatically, not visibly enough for everyone to see, but enough for Emily to know that the realization had begun, that the name, the structure, the authority behind it had connected in a way he could not immediately deny, and he looked up at her again, this time not with dismissal, not with control, but with something closer to calculation, because now he understood that this was not a disruption, it was a replacement, and Emily let that moment linger. Let him sit inside that realization without interruption, because this was the part he needed to feel, the absence of certainty. The loss of assumption, and she took one small step forward, closing the distance just enough to ensure that when she spoke next, it was not for the room, not for the guests, but for him, and yet everyone heard it anyway. "You reduce me to what made you comfortable," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "But comfort is not control." And the statement did not rise, did not fall, it simply existed, undeniable, and behind her the man in the navy suit adjusted his stance slightly, waiting. Always waiting, because timing was everything, and Emily's gaze held Richard's for one final second before she added quietly, "And tonight you ran out of both." And across the room the illusion fully broke, not with noise, not with chaos, but with the unmistakable understanding that whatever power had defined this space no longer belonged to the man who thought he owned it, and for the first time that night, no one looked at Emily as someone beneath them, they looked at her as something else. Entirely, something they had failed to recognize until it was too late. When power begins to collapse, it does not shatter, it quietly stops responding. The room no longer belonged to Richard Vaughan, even if he was the only one still trying to stand at its center, and the difference was subtle but undeniable. It was in the way no one laughed at his silence anymore, in the way no one rushed to fill the space with agreement, in the way every guest had shifted just slightly away from him without fully realizing it, as if instinct had taken over where logic had not yet caught up. And Richard looked down at the document again, slower this time, reading not just the words but the implications behind them, the structure, the authority, the network it represented, and his grip tightened just enough to crease the edge of the paper, a detail small enough to escape most eyes but not Emily's, because she had learned to read him long before tonight, learned where confidence ended and calculation began, and this was calculation under pressure, and Vanessa stepped forward now, her voice breaking through the silence with a sharp edge that did not quite hide the uncertainty beneath it. "This is ridiculous, some kind of misunderstanding, you cannot just walk in here and—" But her words lost shape before they could land, because the man in the navy suit turned his attention to her with a calm that carried no need for interruption, and when he spoke, it was not louder, not harsher, just final. "Ma'am, the changes are already in effect." And that was the moment her composure faltered completely, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough for the illusion she had built around herself to crack, and she glanced at Richard, searching for reassurance, for direction, for the version of him that always had an answer, but what she found instead was hesitation, the kind that could not be hidden, and around them the room continued to shift, one guest quietly setting his glass down without taking another sip, another stepping toward the exit with an apology that no one stopped to acknowledge. And the quiet authority that had once defined the evening dissolved into something far less stable, something uncertain, something watching, and Emily stood at the center of it all, not raising her voice, not demanding attention, simply existing in a way that made everything else reorganize around her, and she did not rush the moment, did not force it forward, because control was no longer something she needed to prove. It was something that had already been established, and Richard exhaled slowly. A controlled breath, the kind used to reset, to regain footing, and when he spoke again his tone had changed, not softened, but sharpened, more precise, more careful. "You are making a very calculated move," he said, his eyes fixed on her now with a different kind of focus. Not dismissive, not dominant, but assessing. "But you are still standing in my house." And for a fraction of a second the room held on to that statement, as if waiting for it to restore balance. But Emily's expression did not shift, not even slightly, and she tilted her head just enough to acknowledge the claim without accepting it, and then she answered, her voice quiet, almost conversational. "You are confusing ownership with access." And the words settled into the space between them with a clarity that did not require explanation. And behind her the man in the navy suit extended his hand slightly, and another individual stepped forward from near the entrance, this one holding a tablet, screen already active, already displaying something that did not belong to the world Richard believed he controlled, and he turned it toward him without hesitation, without ceremony. And Richard's eyes moved to it almost against his will, drawn by the certainty in the gesture, and what he saw there was not a threat, not a warning, but confirmation, properties reassigned, holdings restructured, authority redirected through channels he did not have the power to override, and for the first time that night, the silence around him was not something he could shape, it was something he had to stand inside without control, and Emily watched him take that in, watched the exact moment where understanding replaced resistance, not fully, not completely, but enough to shift the foundation of everything he thought he knew, and she did not press further, did not escalate, because the unraveling did not need assistance anymore, it was already in motion, and she took a single step back, not retreating, but repositioning, as if the center of the room no longer required her presence to remain stable, and in that quiet movement, in that absence of force, the truth became unavoidable. That what had been taken from her had never truly been lost, it had only been waiting for the moment when it would no longer ask to be recognized. The most dangerous shift is the one that happens without a single raised voice. No one spoke now, not because they were told to be silent, but because something deeper had taken hold, something that made every word feel unnecessary, even risky, and Richard Vaughan stood at the center of it, still holding the tablet, still staring at the data that no longer obeyed him, and the weight of that realization settled slowly, methodically, as if his mind refused to accept it all at once, because accepting it meant acknowledging that control had never been as absolute as he believed. And across the room Vanessa took a step back, not dramatic, not obvious, just enough to create distance, her instincts reacting before her thoughts could catch up, and she crossed her arms lightly as if that could restore composure. But the shift had already happened, and everyone could feel it, the subtle reordering of importance, the recalibration of attention, and where once Richard commanded the room effortlessly, now every glance moved past him, toward Emily, toward the quiet certainty she carried without effort. And she did not move to reclaim space, she did not speak to fill the silence, she simply allowed it to exist, allowed the truth to settle in its own time, because forcing it would only reduce its impact. And behind her the man in the navy suit stepped slightly to the side, creating space rather than occupying it, a silent acknowledgement that the moment no longer belonged to process, it belonged to outcome, and Richard finally lowered the tablet, his gaze lifting slowly to meet Emily's again. But this time there was no dismissal left, no instinct to correct or control, only calculation, sharp and immediate, the kind that tries to rebuild structure from collapse, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter, more deliberate. "You planned this," he said, not as an accusation, but as a realization, and Emily did not deny it, did not confirm it, she simply held his gaze, and in that silence the answer became obvious, and a few guests shifted again, some stepping closer to the walls, others inching toward the exit, not wanting to be caught in the center of something they did not fully understand but knew they could not influence. And the room that had once felt like a stage now felt like a boundary, a line separating those who still believed they had control from those who understood it had already changed hands, and Vanessa exhaled sharply, her composure tightening again as she stepped forward, her voice returning but lacking its earlier confidence. "You think this changes anything?" she said, her tone firm but edged with something uncertain. "You think people will just forget who he is?" And Emily turned her head slightly toward her, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the question without granting it weight, and when she responded, her voice remained calm, almost distant. "People do not forget power," she said softly. "They adjust to it." And the distinction settled heavily into the room, because it reframed everything, not as a fall, but as a transition, and Richard's expression hardened again, not with anger, but with recognition, because he understood what that meant, that this was not about humiliation, not about exposure, but about replacement, and that made it far more dangerous, and he took a step to the side now. Subtly, repositioning himself not as the center, but as someone adapting to a new structure, and even that movement did not go unnoticed, because it confirmed what no one had said out loud yet, that the balance had already shifted, and Emily watched it all without reaction, her posture steady, her breathing even, because this was the moment she had waited for, not the confrontation, not the reveal, but the quiet acceptance that followed, the point where resistance no longer served a purpose. And the antique clock struck again, marking another passing minute, each second carrying them further away from what the night had been and deeper into what it had become, and in that measured silence, with no raised voices, no dramatic gestures, the truth completed its arrival, not by force, but by presence, and no one in that room could pretend they had not seen it happen. Some endings do not arrive with noise, they arrive with permission. The room had already changed, not in appearance but in gravity, and every person standing there could feel it, the quiet understanding that what had once defined the space no longer applied, and Emily did not rush to claim anything, she did not raise her voice, did not demand recognition, because she no longer needed to. The shift had already happened without her asking for it, and that was what made it undeniable. And Richard Vaughan stood still for a moment longer, his mind moving faster than his expression allowed, recalculating, restructuring, searching for leverage that no longer existed in the form he understood, and when he finally spoke again, his tone had lost something subtle but essential, not authority, not entirely, but certainty. This does not erase what I built, he said, the words measured, deliberate, as if anchoring himself to something familiar, and Emily looked at him for a second longer than necessary, not dismissing, not challenging, simply acknowledging, and then she replied quietly, "No, it reveals it." And the distinction settled deeper than anything said before, because it reframed the entire narrative, not as a loss, but as exposure, and around them the last fragments of pretense dissolved completely. A guest, quietly excusing himself without waiting for a response, another placing her phone into her purse with a careful movement that suggested she understood more than she wanted to admit, and Vanessa stood still now, no longer stepping forward, no longer speaking, her presence shrinking in a way that could not be disguised, because without the structure she had aligned herself with, there was nothing left to reinforce her position. And she glanced at Richard again, not with confidence, but with expectation, waiting for him to restore something that could not be restored, and he did not move, did not answer, because for the first time, he understood that this was not a situation he could command his way out of, and Emily shifted her weight slightly, not retreating, not advancing, simply repositioning herself as if the center of the room no longer required her presence to remain defined. And she turned her gaze briefly toward the guests, not to address them, not to perform, but to acknowledge their awareness, because they were part of this moment whether they chose to be or not, and in that glance there was no request, no appeal, only clarity, and that clarity spread quietly, each person adjusting their stance, their expression, their understanding of what had just taken place, and the man in the navy suit stepped forward once more, not to lead, but to confirm, his voice even, controlled. "All transitions have been completed." And the finality in that statement removed any remaining doubt, not just from Richard, but from everyone present, and Emily nodded once, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but enough to signal that the process was no longer unfolding, it had concluded, and she turned back to Richard one last time, her expression unchanged, her voice steady. "You built a world where I was expected to remain small," she said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating. "And you believed that was sustainable." And she paused, allowing the weight of that belief to settle between them. "It never was." And the words did not linger, they did not need to, because their truth had already been demonstrated, and Richard held her gaze, not responding, not challenging, simply absorbing the reality that stood in front of him. And in that silence something else became clear, something no one had said out loud, that this was not about taking anything from him. It was about removing the illusion that it had ever been fully his to begin with. And Emily took a step back, then another, turning slightly toward the hallway, her movements calm, unhurried, as if the urgency that had once defined her existence here had been completely removed, and no one stopped her, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to contest, and as she walked away from the center of the room, the space did not close behind her, it remained open, redefined, carrying the imprint of what had just occurred, and the antique clock ticked again, marking another second in a night that would not be remembered for its beginning, but for the quiet moment when everything changed without permission being asked. And for the first time, no one in that room questioned who held the power, they only adjusted to it. In the end, power does not need applause, it only needs to be undeniable. The hallway absorbed her footsteps as Emily walked away from the room that had just rewritten itself. Each step steady, unhurried, the quiet rhythm of someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone behind her, and the sounds of the party did not follow, not in the same way, because whatever had existed there before had already dissolved into something else, something uncertain, something that would be talked about long after tonight but never fully understood by those who witnessed it, and she did not look back, not once. Because the version of her that had needed to stand in that room had already completed its purpose, and as she reached the end of the hallway the woman in black stepped forward from the shadows, no longer blending into the background, her posture straight, her presence clear, and for the first time she spoke, her voice calm, professional. "The car is ready." And Emily gave a small nod, not as a command, not as a request, but as acknowledgement, because everything that needed to be said had already been said without noise, and they moved together toward the exit, passing through the quiet architecture of a house that no longer held meaning for her, the polished surfaces, the controlled lighting, the carefully designed spaces now reduced to nothing more than structures she had outgrown, and outside the air felt different, cooler, cleaner, the distant hum of the city carrying on without interruption, because the world did not pause for moments like this, it adjusted to them. And the black car waited at the curb, its presence understated but precise, and as the door opened Emily paused for a fraction of a second, not in hesitation, but in reflection, the kind that does not dwell, only registers, and then she stepped inside, her movement fluid, controlled, as if she had always belonged to this version of the moment, and the door closed with a soft finality that did not echo, did not demand attention, it simply ended something that had already been over. And back inside the mansion the room remained filled but empty at the same time. The guests scattered into smaller groups, voices low, measured, every conversation now carrying the same unspoken question, how much of what they believed had just been undone, and Richard Vaughan stood where she had left him, not at the center anymore, not even attempting to reclaim it, the tablet still in his hand though he no longer looked at it, because the information it held had already moved beyond something he could negotiate with, and Vanessa remained a step behind him, her earlier confidence gone entirely, replaced by a stillness that suggested she understood the shift but did not know how to exist within it. And for a long moment no one spoke to him, no one approached, because the gravity that once pulled people in had disappeared, leaving only the outline of what used to be, and Richard exhaled slowly, not in defeat, not entirely, but in recognition, the kind that does not come with immediate reaction, only delayed understanding, and across the city lights continued to move, systems continued to adjust. And somewhere high above the skyline a name that had not been spoken in that room until tonight settled into place across networks and structures far beyond its walls, Carter. Not announced, not celebrated, simply present, and inside the car Emily leaned back slightly, her hand resting once more on her stomach, her gaze directed forward through the glass, not focused on anything specific, just steady. And for the first time that night there was no weight in her posture, no tension in her breath, only stillness, the kind that comes when something long delayed has finally aligned. And the car pulled away from the curb without urgency, merging into the flow of the city. As if it had always been part of it, and no one watching would have known that inside it sat the quiet center of a shift that had just redrawn the balance of power in a room full of people who thought they understood it, and as the distance grew, the house behind her became smaller, less defined, until it was just another structure among many, and Emily did not turn to see it, because some endings do not require witnesses. They only require departure, and in the silence that followed, one truth remained, not spoken, not declared but understood, that some people do not lose everything when they walk away, they reveal that they never truly belong to what they left behind.